Good evening and welcome to the next in our series of In Conversations coming to you via the Royal Society of Medicine. And I'm very delighted today to say that our guest is going to be Professor Andrew Roberts, journalist, historian, and also visiting professor at King's College London, where he's professor in the Department of War Studies, prolific author, a man whose books have figured in the New York Times bestsellers almost continuously, really, for years after years. But Andrew, first of all, you're also a very gregarious and social character, I think is one way of putting it. Probably the person least likely to cope with social distancing that I can think of. How are you managing it?
Actually, I'm enjoying it enormously. It's a terrible thing to say. Obviously, I know that I shouldn't be. However, it's given me a time to research my next book, a biography of King George III. I managed to get a lot of books out of the London Library. They also, because they're such a wonderful place, send you them through the post. And so as a result, I'm doing more work now than I could possibly have ever hoped to have done at this stage in the research of my book. So I'm afraid it's come at the absolutely ideal time for me. I feel guilty. I know it's wrong to say anything positive about COVID-19, but it's sort of so far working for me.
Okay. But you work very early, don't you? You get up early in the morning.
Yes, I start work at about 4 o'clock or 4:30 every morning because nobody can call you for a good 4.5 or 5 hours. So you can completely concentrate and sort of deep dive into whatever you need to be researching. I have a Churchillian nap every afternoon and have done since I was at university. 35 or so years ago, and I think that also, like with Winston Churchill, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it actually will extend my life rather than shorten.
Okay, I sort of imagine maybe 6 o'clock pouring yourself a large whiskey, putting on your cape and cloak and striding out into the party world of London. Oh, excellent, so you can still do that. Okay. and your many fans will be somewhat shocked to see, it looks to me like you're growing a beard.
Yeah, only for the lockdown. I promise you it's not going to last anything longer than that. As the minute that the lockdown's over, I'm going to the and get
I don't think the lockdown can come soon enough, to be honest.
I had a hope that it was going to be a little sort of bit like King George V stroke Tsar Nicholas II, but
Okay.
I mean, it's a little bit more like Captain Birdseye.
Yes. Okay, now then, to business a little bit. I've started all of these discussions with the various people we've been having by asking the kind of question of the day, which is this. Everyone seems to think, or many people use the analogy that COVID crisis is a war. That Trump says it is, says that about everything, I suppose. WHO says it is, all sorts of people, and surprisingly say it is a war. But you're a historian of war. Is that the right analogy? Are we at war with the virus?
I think we are, yes. I think it's a perfectly reasonable analogy to have. I think that politicians use it all the time. They go on campaigns and fight struggles and so on. I think there's no problem with calling it a war. We are, after all, losing the largest number of people in peacetime. And so in that sense, you have to go back to the Second World War to see these kind of numbers. Although I think it's worthwhile remembering that even more people died on the first day of the Somme on the 1st of July 1916 than have died so far, at least, from COVID-19. 19,240 British soldiers perished that single day. So in that sense, of course, it's not possible to equate the two. Churchill himself did call disease the enemy, and I've got a rather wonderful quote that I'd just like to, if it's okay,
Please.
He was speaking to the Royal College of Physicians, your brother organisation, on the 2nd of March 1944. And he said this: "The discoveries of healing science must be the inheritance of all. That is clear. Disease must be attacked, whether it occurs in the poorest or the richest man or woman, simply on the ground that it is the enemy. And it must be attacked just in the same way as the fire brigade will give its full assistance to the humblest cottage as readily as to the most important mansion." So he certainly saw it as an enemy that must be fought.
Okay. I mean, Churchill also lived through the great pandemics, and in the greatest of them all, the Spanish flu. which killed, I believe, 50 million. But I've heard you say this before, actually, and I've also been asked by Laura Spinney to ask me this. She wrote one of the few books on the pandemic, Pale Rider. But she says that what she's asked is, how can you explain why the First World War has produced even more books than you've written, I think, and yet we virtually no one until very recently had even heard of the pandemic at all, despite the fact its casualty bill was higher than the First World War. Why do you remember wars more often than we do pandemics?
Because nobody's intending to kill you. I think that's the ultimate thing. If you know that there are Germans, Turks, and so on who are hoping and scheming and intending to kill you, it's so much more interesting than just one single numbered evil disease. And also, of course, the other key thing is that it doesn't have, and this is where it differs very much, of course, from a proper war, is that it doesn't, the enemy, COVID-19, doesn't have a intelligence unit. It can't hear what we're saying and thinking about it. And so we can plan openly in a way that Lord Alan Brooke and General Marshall and FDR and Winston Churchill, of course, couldn't, about how to defeat it.
And already we've had a question coming in on that. It says, if it's taken 100 years to write a good book about Spanish flu, and I would definitely recommend Laura's, what will we be saying in 50 to 100 years' time about this one?
Well, I think we'll have had an awful lot more books about it. Else. Laura Spinney's book is excellent. I've quoted from it many times, and there's only one other one. And so in that sense, you're right. I think we're going to have a plethora of coronavirus books by this time next year. The interesting thing, I think, will be, and I've spoken to a couple of publishers about this, not because I'm interested in it, I don't have the capacity for that at all, but I wonder how many people are going to read them. Because again, when you're writing about a war, you are emotionally connected to and fascinated by the interaction between both sides. Whereas here we have one evil, implacable disease, but it's not one with a personality that alters and various people that are altering their stance as well. The strategy has to pretty much stay the same from coronavirus's point of view. It's us working out what that strategy is that's going to be interesting. So I don't think that we're going to get as many books. I will certainly get many more than two, but I don't think we're going to get as many as on the First World War.
No. Okay. Well, let's start with your books then in your career. And your first book, 1991, The Holy Fox, a biography of Lord Halifax. Now, I haven't warned you about this, but I wanted to play a little game as we go along with each of the kind of leaders that we might come across. And it's the one that I'm sure you will recognize this, but it was invented by the late Malcolm Muggeridge. And this is bishops or bookies.
Yeah.
Does that ring a bell?
It totally does. It's a quotation I use the whole time myself. Excellent. I love it, and it does work.
Explain the rules.
Well, very basically, you can break down every British Prime Minister and by the way, I think it also probably works with American presidents, into either bishops or bookies. And you're now going to take me through each of my books and ask me whether or not I have a propensity for bishops or bookies.
Yeah.
Mentally, I've already worked out, in fact, that it's about 50-50. And also there are some prime ministers who pretend to be bishops but are actually bookies. Tony Blair being a classic example of that, although I'm not writing about him. And also some who pretend to be bookies but are actually bishops. And there I think you might fit in Harold Macmillan. So anyway, let's go.
Let's start with...
You take over.
Yeah, well, I mean, we mentioned Halifax, okay? Now, first of all...
Local bishop.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have been an actual bishop. His father, interestingly, was the last person to make a really serious attempt, in 1934 it was, to bring the Roman Catholic and the Protestant churches together at the Malines conversations. So you couldn't get more ecclesiastical, Episcopalian than than Lord Halifax.
Okay, so we've got number one Bishop, but a lot of people, I think, will not really be that familiar with Halifax. Just kind of introduce him a bit to the audience. And well, why did you choose him as the subject of what was your first and very successful book? Michael Howard said it's the best of its kind.
Well, it's very kind of you to say that, and Michael, and it did get very nice reviews. But I think I've met every single person who ever actually bought that book.
Yes.
I think that the advance for it didn't quite pay for the taxi home from my publishers having signed the contract. But people were very nice about it in reviews. And I think that the key thing about Lord Halifax, who was Viceroy of India and Foreign Secretary famously at the time of Munich, and he was Winston Churchill's first Foreign Secretary, as well as Neville Chamberlain's Foreign Secretary, was that he's most famous for being the person who didn't become Prime Minister instead of Winston Churchill on Thursday, the 9th of May, 1940. He was that other man in the room who supposedly stayed quiet for 2 minutes until he backed down and admitted that Churchill was going to be the better person for the job.
So he, as you say, he's famous, and he probably, I mean, it's to all our, fortunate for us that he did have insight that he probably wasn't a great leader.
Yes, and he wasn't interested enough in war. I mean, had it happened in peacetime, I think that Halifax would have fought hard to have become Prime Minister. It was something that he wanted to be all his life. However, he understood that this was a global conflict, and his speciality was really, as far as he was concerned, peace negotiation and not war. And of course, he was also involved in late May 1940 in the attempt by the Foreign Office to explore peace negotiations with Adolf Hitler, and that was another reason that he and Churchill came into a kind of sotto voce conflict, and which led to him being exiled to Washington, D.C. for the rest of the war in December 1940.
He was the ambassador there, wasn't he? Yeah. But, okay, so May the 9th, 1940 then brings your most the author of your first book, and the author, the character of your probably most famous book now, the Churchill. And I always thought it was Churchill who never said anything, but the opinions.
Well, the fact is, it never happened. Churchill got I go into this in extraordinary, some say pernickety detail in chapter 21 of my biography of Winston Churchill, Churchill Walking with Destiny, because it's so important, this. And I don't think it ever happened either, this supposed 2-minute silence. 2 minutes is an incredibly long time for 4 men in a room to stay completely silent. And in fact, a few seconds can start to become cringe-makingly embarrassing. Imagine if you and I just went silent for 2 minutes now, Simon. What happened, I think, was that Churchill did the same thing as he had always done all the way through his life when he came up with the possibility of getting a job that he wanted. You see it again and again in his career, and that is he jolly well asked for it. He, in this case, I think, demanded it. And Lord Halifax, having got Adolf Hitler wrong continually throughout the 1930s, and the other 2 people in the room being Neville Chamberlain, who had done the same, and the chief whip, David Margeson, who had also done the same, they were just forced by the moral force of Churchill's argument to allow him to become Prime Minister. He'd been First Lord of the Admiralty for 8 months, and a successful one. Not as successful as he had claimed, but nonetheless successful. And
might come back to that. Let's move.
They were in no position to refuse his demand for the premiership.
I mean, Halifax actually found Goering quite charming, and also quite liked Goebbels, didn't he?
Yes, and there was also that incredibly embarrassing moment when his car arrived at Berchtesgaden, where he was going to be meeting the Führer, and he saw out of the window of the car a pair of legs and a uniform, he got out of the car and was about to hand him his hat and coat when he realised that it was in fact Hitler.
Know that. Okay. So now Halifax, then, I think you may still be the only biographer of Halifax. You're certainly
Probably for the next half century.
But by your own reckoning, you're the 1010th biographer of Churchill. For God's sake, why on earth do we need another Churchill biography?
Yes, 1010. And I don't for a moment think that mine's going to be the last biography of him for a while either. The fact is, I was tremendously fortunate in my timing. Her Majesty the Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to be allowed to use her father, King George VI's diaries and his wartime diaries, which were completely invaluable. He knew King George VI, of course, very well, but nonetheless, they might not have got on with one another because, of course, the king had been a huge supporter of the policy of obedience. And Churchill had been a staunch supporter of the king's elder brother, Edward VIII, during the abdication crisis. But they did get on right from the beginning at the time of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. And the king was given all of the great secrets of the Second World War, the nuclear secrets, the ultra decrypts, who was going to be hired and fired, which countries were going to be invaded, and so on. And he wrote everything down about these weekly meetings every Tuesday lunchtime that he had with Winston Churchill throughout the Second World War. And it was therefore a fantastic and extraordinary and wonderful new source, because of course Churchill trusted the king and the king trusted Churchill. But also there have been no fewer than 41 sets of papers that have been deposited at Churchill College archives in Cambridge University since the last major biography of him, including the wartime diaries of Churchill's daughter, Mary Soane. There's been the diaries of Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador, 1932 to 43, which have been published in Moscow over the last 4 years, which no other biographer of Churchill had got to yet. I myself was fortunate enough to find the verbatim accounts of the War Cabinet. And so we now know what everybody said in each of those War Cabinet meetings. The Churchill family were tremendously generous to me as well. I was allowed to use the love letters of Pamela Harriman, who led a very active life during the Second World War. And so there are new things to say. And I think pretty much in every page of this book, there is something that has not appeared in any other biography of Winston Churchill.
She was active in many ways, was she not? But yeah, but let's stick with the king for a bit then. I mean, you in Eminent Churchillians, you have a chapter on the king, and you point out that he wasn't the brightest cookie in the block, was he? He was bottom of his class at Naval College.
No, absolutely no. Nobody would put him down as an intellectual, but luckily he was an extremely good diarist. Wrote down what Churchill actually said, which is much better than those diarists that invent things. And his heart was in the right place. He was a fantastically patriotic, decent, honourable, upstanding man. And those things come through loud and clear whenever you look at King George VI and research him. I think also it was tremendously useful for him, of course, also to have the Queen Mother, late Queen Mother, as his wife and his principal advisor. And she had an absolutely fabulous ear for public relations, of course, and for the whole concept of what the monarchy should be doing in a crisis as terrible as the Second World War. And if I may say, you could hear when Her Majesty the Queen gave that wonderful broadcast on coronavirus, you could hear many, many echoes of King George VI and the Queen Mother in the remarks that she was making. She was her parents' daughter that evening. Yes.
And it's clear where she is on, are we at war or not, by ending with we'll meet again. It's a pretty clear signal to what she thinks, quite right. Now then, someone has asked, quite legitimately, you've sketched over a little bit, because, I mean, I mean, I think you're going to think that Churchill is a bookie, aren't you? You put him in the bookie class.
Yes, yes. Although he could do occasionally, he could do a pretty good bishop. I mean, I think that that speech I quoted earlier to you to the Royal College of Physicians, had a nice sort of turn. You wouldn't feel bad if you heard that from a pulpit, would you?
But no, that's true. But he's a bookie who made a lot of bad bets, didn't he? I mean, he got a lot of things wrong.
Again and again. No, your question is absolutely right. Oh my God, the blunders that he made again and again in his career. He got, well, we've already mentioned the abdication crisis. He got that wildly wrong, of course. He got the gold standard wrong, votes for women, the whole Dardanelles catastrophe. Of course, was very largely down to him. I mean, everybody else supported it at the beginning, but he was the person who kept pushing it all the way through, right to the end. So, and there are many other examples, of course, of things.
The particular example that's been brought up, because it's very relevant to that meeting on May the 9th, is he'd presided over the campaign in Norway and the Narvik disaster. And someone said, was that actually covered up? How on earth did he get away?
No, not in the slightest bit covered up. They'd had, he was chosen in that meeting on the 9th of May. And in the previous 48 hours, on the 7th and the 8th, they'd had the Norway debate, in which the whole of the disaster was gone into in immense detail in the House of Commons, with the most extraordinary series of speeches. But the point about it was that, of course, he had been flung into that almost immediately on becoming First Lord of the Admiralty, and he hadn't been in office for 10 years. So he, throughout the 1930s, had been arguing, in the wilderness years, as he called them, for rearmament. And the fact is that the reason that we lost the Norway campaign was that we didn't have enough ships and men and planes and so on. And so it couldn't be blamed on him that we had not rearmed in the 1930s. He'd spent the entire decade begging the British governments to do that. And so he was given a bit of a pink ticket, frankly, over the disaster in Norway, which you and your correspondent points out was much more down to him, in fact, than it was down to Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister who was brought down by that debate.
I mean, it was an amazing debate. I mean, the image of, that's the one where Roger Keyes turns up in his full bib, doesn't he? And
he turned up with his with 6 rows of medals. He was he turned up in his full dress uniform as Admiral of the Fleet, and he denounced the Chamberlain government, and of course Leo Amery as well, the great sort of Tory who said to Neville Chamberlain, "Go in the name of God, go," using the same words that Cromwell had used on dismissing the Rump Parliament. So you have this splendid scene, great sort of theatrical scene. But Churchill, all the way through it, had to defend his Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. So although he was likely to be the beneficiary of Chamberlain losing, he still had to give a barnstorming performance in defence of Chamberlain at the very end of the debate. 7, just to point out, there's something very interesting about that debate. Of the 7 major speeches that were given, Clement Attlee's being the 7th, actually 6 of them, including by Roger Keyes, 6 of them were given by Leo Amery, given by members of the other club, his great group of friends who which had been set up in 1911 and were people who understood him and knew him and wanted him to be Prime Minister.
That's the one that meets at the Savoy, isn't it?
It does, yes. It meets every once a month at the Savoy in the Pinafore Room. It's the most wonderful occasion.
I'm guessing you're a member.
I think you're not allowed to say whether you are.
No, aren't you? Okay.
Certainly not publicly stating.
I'm pretty sure I've seen your picture there. No, I'm joking. bet it is. Anyway, yeah. So, but well, just to continue that theme, just a bit of that. Churchill's reception wasn't great, was it? I mean, I can't remember who it was now, but someone said we've given the government to the greatest adventure in modern political history. I actually can't remember who that was, but
that was Jock Colville, who
John Colville,
of course was Prime Minister. It was the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain's private secretary, and then became Winston Churchill's private secretary. And as you say, he obviously didn't like him at all at that stage. It was at a moment when they were having a glass of champagne with Chips Channon, the diarist and MP, Ram Butler, the Undersecretary at the Foreign Office, and Alec Hume, who later, of course, Alec Douglas as he was then, later became Prime Minister as Alec Douglas Hume. And all of these people toasted in champagne on the day that Churchill became Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who they believed should not have been ousted.
Yeah, and on that subject still, is I don't know which your favourite Churchill speech is, but actually my favourite is the eulogy that he gave for Chamberlain into the House after he died. I think that's one of his most beautiful speeches. Can I
go and read you the unless you've got it there, can I just read?
I haven't, no.
Okay, stay there 1 second.
Okay. Yeah.
Luckily, because it's my favourite speech too.
I genuinely didn't know that, Andrew.
No. This has not been set up, listeners. This has not been set up. Genuinely hasn't.
It's the passage about
history, about the flickering lamp.
Yes, and what was his sin? To be deceived by a wicked man. Yeah.
No, that's not the paragraph I'm reading.
Well, you
Can I do the bit that I like best?
Yes.
Sorry about that, Simon.
No.
And that's also a very good positive. I agree. However, this is the moment. This shows you Churchill's poetic sense, as well as this is the bishop bit. I'll give you that undoubtedly, not least because he's in Westminster Abbey when he performs it.
All right. Yeah.
Just to give you the timing, it's Westminster Abbey, mid-November 1940. All freezing cold. All of the stained glass windows have been taken out because of the Blitz, and so by taken out I mean physically removed and taken off, I think, to Wales to make sure they weren't destroyed, and so the abbey was boarded up, and so it was freezing cold inside as well. Everyone wearing overcoats inside the abbey, and Churchill goes up to give his eulogy to Neville Chamberlain, the man who had, of course, kept him out of government throughout the 1930s, largely ignored his warnings, had rearmed, but extremely late, and also who had betrayed Czechoslovakia in the Munich crisis over the Sudeten So somebody who, although he had proved a very loyal minister working for Churchill since May 1940, nonetheless is somebody who Churchill could, if he'd wanted to, could have eviscerated. He wasn't going to do that for political reasons, not least because most of the Conservative Party still considered themselves Chamberlainites rather than Churchillians. However, he also wasn't going to do that because he recognised that Chamberlain had done what he thought was right. In this paragraph, in which he's talking about history and the writing of history, which is, of course, one of the reasons this means so much to me, he's also talking about the morality of doing in politics what you believe. And so I'm just going to read it because I love it. History, with its flickering lamp, stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, and kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days. What is the worth of all this? The only guide to a man is his conscience. The only shield to his memory is the rectitude and sincerity of his actions. it's very imprudent to walk through life without this shield, because we are so often mocked by the failure of our hopes and the upsetting of our calculations. But with this shield, however the fates may play, we march always in the ranks of honour.
Good, good. And I think he didn't. I think he said to one of his companions, I can't remember who said, he said, "I could have written it the other way if I'd wanted to." Something.
Of course. I mean, like any politician, he had the capacity to turn on a sixpence if he needed to, and if he if he'd wanted to, and he did, of course, in his life, both before and after, he did say some extremely rude things about Chamberlain.
Mm.
But when it came to giving the man's eulogy in front of his widow at his funeral, needless to say, he brought out something that is utterly sublime.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people are asking about Boris. We'll come to that at the end, okay? But what this is, however, a good point to put another question from Joanna Hawthorne, who is talking about Clementine. And just how important do you think that she is to Churchill's political career and success, particularly in the times of trial?
Well, she's not at all important in terms of his political choices. The decisions that he made were not influenced by her. However, at key moments of his life, she was essential. She was the person who kept him in the trenches in 1916, for example. He wanted to come back and try to bring down the Asquith government, but she spotted that, of course, that would have been disastrous to have left his command of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers in the trenches and to have gone back into politics too quickly after the Dardanelles catastrophe. And so even though it pained her daily, because, of course, he was actually being shot at daily and shelled daily in the trenches, and she was desperate that he would be killed. Nonetheless, she gave him that superb advice because she recognised that if he had destroyed his career, it would have destroyed his life just as much as being shot or shelled. Second thing was, of course, in 1940, where he started to become impossible to work for, immensely difficult, and she claimed in a letter in 1940, the only one she wrote to him, because of course she was living at number 10 with him, so she didn't need to write to him, but she wrote this down because she knew that he needed to take it seriously. She said that he was becoming a beast to everyone around him and needed to be kinder to his private secretaries and his stenographers and so on, and he was. So there are moments where she matters enormously, but I mean, I've seen some recent books that claim that she had serious influence on day-to-day politics and strategy and so on, and I certainly didn't find it in the 30 years that I've been writing about Churchill. Okay, and then another one, again relevant, I suppose. We are the Royal Society of Medicine. The thorny issue of Churchill and his mental health, as we would now call it, but it certainly wasn't called it in those days. I'm not myself particularly convinced by this, but you're the historian. The idea of Churchill is infamous, but hard to pin down. Black dog and depression. Well, where are you on that one? Well, it's the reason it's hard to pin down is because I don't believe it existed. Just the expression once in his entire career in July 1911, when he was writing to Clementine about himself. But it was also at a time when the phrase black dog was used by Edwardian matrons to explain their badly tempered children. He chaired over 900 meetings of the Defence Committee of the War Cabinet during the Second World War at all times of day and night. The idea of him being able to do this if he was suffering from some kind of a chemical imbalance strikes me as next to impossible. The people around him certainly didn't believe that he was a manic depressive, or I've even seen bipolar disorder attributed to him. They did recognise, of course, that he got depressed. We mentioned the Dardanelles crisis. He was very depressed during that time. He was depressed in February 1942 at the fall of Singapore and at the fall of Tobruk in June 1942. But these are moments that any sentient being would have got depressed, any decision maker. And it certainly doesn't imply, to my mind, that he was suffering from manic depression.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, he certainly came close. I think we'd probably call it an adjustment disorder or something these days after Gallipoli. I mean, he was certainly deeply, a bit more than depressed. He was really agitated, wasn't he?
Yes, but equally, he decided that the best thing to do was to go and serve in the trenches, and certainly didn't seem the slightest bit agitated then. He was completely calm and in control. You read the diaries of his adjutant and all the people who were serving with him in the trenches, and actually he was the perfect commander, really. I mean, he did, like everybody else in the trenches at the time, officers and men, he did self-medicate to a degree with alcohol. And that's another aspect, of course, of the myth of Winston Churchill, which was that he was a hopeless alcoholic, which is something that the Nazis put out and his political opponents in Britain very often put out. But here again, I think it's wrong. He had the most rhinocerine capacity for alcohol. His friend C.P. Snow, the journalist, said, I'm so sorry, C.P. Scott, the journalist, said C.P. Snow, obviously much grander than a journalist, but C.P. Scott said that Winston Churchill couldn't have been an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much. And there is definitely something to this. He was able to chair all of these defence committees of the war cabinets, as I say, at all times of day and night. We only have one occasion when the other people around that table thought that he was drunk, and this is, or wrote in their diaries at least, that he was drunk on the 7th of March 1944. And what they did, it was at Chequers, what they did on that occasion was to hold the same meeting the next day as though the last one hadn't happened.
Oh gosh, there were so many meetings. I wish that could have happened. Oh dear, oh dear. Okay, I think he said that he took more out of alcohol than it took out of him, or something.
There are lots of those. There are lots of those remarks. But I do think that with that joke, as with so many other Churchill jokes, actually it did have a kernel of truth to it.
Yeah. Now I want to kind of broaden it a bit. We're still talking about leadership here, and I really want to move on to one of your. This is actually my favourite of your books, Masters and Commanders.
Hold it up a bit.
Oh right, you're not seeing. I've got it.
Thank you.
Books, the least we can do. And I'd like you to, first of all, I want you to introduce us to a person who I think is really undeservedly overlooked, and this is Alan Brooke. And first of all, what is he, bookie or bishop?
Oh no, he's a bishop.
Yeah,
bishop, yes,
yeah.
He's a bishop. He's a bishop who disapproved of Churchill's bookie-like behaviour on pretty much every page of his magnificent 700-page diaries, which are an essential resource for
and which he shouldn't have kept, of course.
Which he shouldn't have kept, but then everyone around him did. The King's secretary, Tommy Lassell, shouldn't have kept a diary. The King actually shouldn't really have kept a diary. Churchill put out a general order to everybody in 1940 not to keep a diary. The permanent under secretary kept a diary. His own private secretary, Jock Colville, famously kept a diary. Pretty much everyone around him kept a diary. Hallelujah, thank God they did.
Yes, where would you be?
At least for an historian. Of course, if we'd been invaded and the Nazis had captured any of these diaries, it would have been absolutely catastrophic. Not least because Alan Brooke used to actually put his daily diary into the post to send down to Hampshire for his wife to read.
Oh my God!
Not the kind of security that would get you sacked in a moment from the MOD today. He would be writing about the nuclear bomb and so on. But nonetheless, I think that you're right. Alan Brooke is a massively underestimated figure when it came to the grand strategy. and also to dealing with Churchill. He used to say that Churchill came up with 10 ideas a day, of which one of them was good.
I think, and the
But
other 9s were
one good
wild and
idea a
dangerous.
day, you know, that in itself is a pretty impressive, impressive figure. But you still have to have the bishop there. You still have to have this hard, flinty, tough, 6'2" Ulsterman who would be willing to sit in front of the Prime Minister and break pencils in half in his face, saying, "No, I disagree with you, Prime Minister," in order to get rid of the 9 bad ideas.
I think he called them wild and dangerous, didn't he?
He called him an awful lot worse than that.
A lot worse than that.
Yes, absolutely.
So give us an example of the way in which Alan Brooke would moderate Churchill's ideas. How would that work? Or give an example where he did protect Churchill from folly.
Oh, well, you see it again and again with the ideas of attacking northern Sumatra, northern Norway, those islands in the Mediterranean, are they called the Palantaria Islands?
Rhodes, I think, as well.
Or, I don't know how they're pronounced, I'm sorry, but they're in that book that you very kindly picked up.
Yeah.
And each time he would just go back to basics. He would go back to the intelligence reports. He'd go back to the reports of the War Office and the Admiralty and the Air Ministry and so on, and would calm Churchill down and would block him, basically. And the great thing about Churchill, we mentioned earlier about all his blunders and disasters, and but he learnt from every single one of them. He learnt from each of his mistakes. And the thing that he learnt from the Gallipoli campaign in the Dardanelles that we've discussed earlier is not to overrule the chiefs of staff when all 3 of them agree on something. And so when Alan Brooke, who was very much primus inter pares at the British chiefs of staff, he was chairman of the chiefs of staff, but he was very much the presiding power there. When all 3 of them agreed on something, Churchill was not able to overrule them and didn't try, even though he had every constitutional right to if he'd wanted to, because he was Minister of Defence as well as Prime Minister. So he'd sit there until 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes, arguing and shouting sometimes and banging his fist and crying even on occasion. But if he couldn't get an idea past Alan Brooke, then it did not happen.
And in your commanders, of course, the other commander is Marshall, and you make a good case that it is their relationship that is almost more important than Churchill and Roosevelt when it comes to actually winning the war.
That's right.
It's a coalition together.
Yes, General George C. Marshall, the head of the American Army, Chief of Staff of the American Army from the 1st of September 1939 all the way through the whole of the rest of the war, and very much the most influential figure on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well. His relationship with Brooke really was the one which decided which countries were going to be invaded, when and under what circumstances. Of course, FDR and Churchill had to be taken into account the whole way through, but it was a extraordinary minuet, basically, that was danced for those 4 years between 41 and FDR's death in April 1945, between these 4 people, each of whom thought they knew how to win the Second World War. 3 of them have gone to Staff College, of course. FDR hadn't, but he very much thought that he knew too. And it was FDR's support for Churchill and Brooke's strategy, the Mediterranean, African, Mediterranean and Italian strategy in 1942 to 44, that drew American strength into that theatre, prior, of course, to crossing over the Channel on the 6th of June, 1944.
Do you think that, do you think then that's, because it was argued about, and certainly a lot of lives were lost in Italy, and it was the forgotten campaign, no, not the forgotten, but anyway, it was often overlooked. But do you think that is the secret to D-Day? Yes,
no, he had to do it, first of all in North Africa, and then going over into Italy. You couldn't just cross over the Channel as early as the autumn of 1942, which is when Marshall originally wanted to do it, it was essential that FDR support Brooke and Churchill in preventing Marshall from carrying out that strategy, because the American army was not yet ready, as you could see from the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It wasn't ready to take on the might of the Germans when the Germans had complete air superiority, which they did really up until the early part of 1944. I think it's very instructive to remember that on the actual day of D-Day itself, when the Allies, when the Germans were able to fly 318 sorties over the beaches of Normandy, the Allies flew 13,688. That's the level of air superiority they had by then, and anything earlier could well have been a complete disaster, could have pushed us back off the continent in the same way that had happened at Dunkirk, and would have elongated the Second World War.
Now, if you'd have said in 1943, who's going to be the commander-in-chief overlord for D-Day, an American would have said Marshall and a Brit would have said Alanbrooke. But for neither that was the case. What changed that?
Well, first, the fact that the Americans were producing 60 to 70% of the men were landing in the 30 days after D-Day, as well as on D-Day itself. So you simply had to have an American ultimately. Brooke was promised the job by Churchill. He argues in his diaries he was promised it 3 times, and his heart was broken when Churchill finally at the Quebec conference had to break it to him that in fact it was going to be an American. Marshall, who could have had it if he'd wanted to, if he'd asked for it, actually realized that he needed to be back in Washington, taking care of the president, taking care of the Congress and public opinion, and that although he would have loved to have been the overall Supreme Allied Commander for the Normandy landings, in fact it needed to go to his own protege, General Eisenhower, who he had appointed to take charge of Operation Torch back in November 1942, the invasion of North Africa.
Okay, so Brooke never really forgave Churchill, did he, for that? Although he would.
Well, he didn't like him very much before. So I think not forgiving him is a very charming British understatement of yours, Simon.
Okay, and I do like it in Master and Commanders. I think I can't remember which chapter it is, but you talk about how Churchill tells Alanbrooke, which is from Brooke's diaries, I assume, the only thing worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting one without allies. And in the end, Churchill does manage that, doesn't he?
Yes, no, of course, exactly. And you recognise, of course, the Oscar Wilde, the echo of Oscar Wilde in that quotation as well. Yes, but I think actually they worked very well in harness, although it was always a tension between Brooke and Churchill. It was a creative tension because Churchill knew that Brooke could take on Marshall, and he believed, rightly until quite late on in the war, that he was able himself to charm Roosevelt. It's a fascinating relationship, of course, between Churchill and Roosevelt. There is a genuine friendship there, but also they at no point forget that they are working for their own countries. So by the autumn of 1944, especially once the main body of the Americans are ashore in northwestern, it's the relationship goes into a very cold period. There are over 200 more messages from Churchill to FDR than there are replies from FDR to Churchill. And
it was clear that America was always prepared to support Britain, but was not prepared to support Britain's interests in, for example, Asia or wherever the empire was.
Yes. There's a joke that went around the Pentagon in 1943 that the Southeast Asian commands that Lord Mountbatten was in charge of, SEAC, acted for Save England's Asian Colonies.
He was a bit useless, wasn't he, Mountbatten, at that job? Wasn't he?
Well, I've read this in the book called Eminent Churchillians back in 1994. When I was an angry young man, Simon, I'm a little bit more calm now, and I'm not absolutely certain that I would necessarily go along with all of my strictures against Mountbatten in the war years. Although I do think that he managed to sod up the partition of India monumentally.
I was trying to draw you out there and then say that's what you said, but you recognise that immediately. So we're moving on a little bit towards Churchill's declining years, and as I say, we're a Society of Medicine, and several people. See, Pete Greenhouse, it must be the guy that I used to play in a band with. If it is him, is asking about Lord Moran, and a complicated figure that has divided historians, and he was Charles Wilson, I remember the First War, but became Churchill's doctor. And where do you place, do you think Moran was a good doctor to Churchill, or do you think he was, as others say, a betrayal of his trust?
He was a good doctor as far as a physician is concerned. Yes, absolutely. He not least because he kept him alive during the Second War, when Churchill had 4 serious attacks of pneumonia between May 1943 and February 1945. And so in that sense, Lord Moran was an excellent doctor. However, I unfortunately it was impossible to use his papers and his diaries, so-called diaries that he published in Churchill, The Struggle for Survival.
That's right, Struggle for Survival, yeah. Which
all of the people around Churchill denounced when it was published. They said that he had invented quotations, which of course is disaster for a historian. You simply can't use quotations that you suspect are invented, and the notes that he took for the book don't correspond to the published version, and lots of them aren't there anyway. So it's unfortunately, although it's a wonderful read, I'm afraid that were I working in the London Library, I would put it under fiction rather than non-fiction.
That's a pretty clear answer. Okay, so moving on to the present. I mentioned at the start that I didn't think you would cope too well with lockdown, and I think that's still probably right in many respects. You are, I think we can actually say, a Spectator called you the world's greatest name dropper. You were well aware of it.
I come on your show, Simon.
Yes, I know.
Or should I say Sir Simon? and they, after 54 minutes, you tell me that I'm a terrible name.
I know. But it's basically true. You clearly, and I think it's the position of a historian as well. It's very, I think it does open lots of doors, and is very good. But I want to we're moving towards the end, and several people.
You think I'd have done a reasonable job if I such a name that I need to become an historian? Is that what you're telling me?
Well, no, they've asked about Boris, first of all, Boris as a Churchillian, because he's obviously written a biography of Churchill, and I think someone just said, do you get on with him? It's quite a straightforward question. So a little bit about Boris and you.
Well, Boris's book isn't really a biography of Churchill. I helped him a bit with it. He thanks me 2 or 3 times in the book, and which is very sweet of him. Actually, what it is something more interesting than that. It's an attempt to draw a new audience, a younger sort of young adult audience, in to be interested in Churchill. So. I welcome that book, and I'm very impressed with it, and it sold almost as many copies as mine. But as far as his premiership is concerned, I see that he has learned from his own studies in his own book. You see again and again these phrases, the way in which he uses 4 adjectives rather than 3. Most politicians just use 3. He's learnt from Churchill you use 4. the way in which they called for the volunteers, that had so many overtones from the Home Guard speech in June 1940, the widespread overarching police powers that he's taken, which he hopes not to use and isn't needing to use for most of the time, his belief in trusting scientists, which of course is something that Churchill's best friend was a scientist, Professor Lindemann, and he was fascinated by science all his life. You know, there are overtones, undoubtedly. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole thing's going to be wonderful. Winston Churchill lost the 1945 general election, after all. But as far as Boris is concerned, I don't think there's a better politician to learn from, Frank.
It's a fair point. And mention old Lindemann, that brings to mind what Bob Harris said about him. That's the prof, isn't it, in Churchill's circle. He knew an awful lot about the sex life of apes. I think
actually Simeons, I think, didn't he say
Simeons?
Sorry to pick you up, but
okay, you know. But he shouldn't be advising on military strategy. Point he was making. So okay, so you're obviously a biographer, and you only just a couple of days ago quoted Thomas Carlyle: "Biography is by nature the most profitable and pleasant of things," and you're both profitable and pleasurable.
Not necessarily that financially profitable, but emotionally and morally.
Do you think, though, that you will ever change? Do you think you will continue to be writing on the history of basically, you know, your general view is great men create great events? You've written on de Gaulle, you've written on Stalin, various people. Is that your general view of history and biography, that it is still created by great people and we are right to concentrate on them? As opposed to kind of, you know, French intellectual historians who do something rather different, I suspect you don't agree with particularly.
Yes, I think we've gone far too far down as a trade, really, far too far down the French intellectual route, that great men don't matter, that, as T.S. Eliot said, only vast impersonal forces explain history. I think that the Marxist view and the determinist view of history, that great men and women don't matter, has been taken far too far, especially in the academy, both in France, but also here in Britain and in America. And I think I don't mind dedicating my life to trying to edge a tiny inch in the opposite direction and ask, really, would France have invaded Russia in 1812 had it not been for Napoleon? What would genuinely have happened if Lord Halifax had become Prime Minister in May 1940 instead of Winston Churchill and had made peace with Hitler? Do we not think that would have altered the world hugely? This is not down to the impersonal forces of millions or indeed billions of people. It's actually occasionally in history down to just one or two individuals and what their decisions are. And I think, therefore, it is well worth still reading about and writing about what's going through their minds.
I think you do it magnificently. I was going to promote your book on Napoleon, but I will just show that I have it here. Brilliant book as well, full of insights, as you've just said, one of the most extraordinary men ever. Andrew, thank you very much for a wonderful hour, and I've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else has as well, and I can see from the comments. Now, I'm going to ask you to talk us out, but before I do that, just a couple of things for the audience. First of all, to remind them that tomorrow we go back to our lunchtime series of webinars on COVID. It's David Heyman tomorrow, the expert's expert when it comes to pandemics, so that's at 12:30. And then next week, we're having a little change when we go back to this evening series. You need a little bit of a break from all the seriousness we've had. We've had Evan Davis on the economy, Fergal Keane on Ireland and Rwanda, and now Andrew on Churchill. Next week, Roger Kirby, my successor as president, is going to be interviewing Jane McQuitty, the wine correspondent of the Times. Now, I've heard that in the first week of the lockdown, alcohol sales increased by 50% over the same time last year. So there will be a lot to talk about. And can I also say to the audience listening that these webinars are free, but we are not, as it were. We invite you then to support the Royal Society of Medicine in these difficult times, now more than ever, because we do need your help to continue our work. Have a look at the webpage, look at make your donation. All of that will fund the RSM's vision of advancing health through education and innovation. And that should be on your screens as we finish. And I thank you in advance for your generosity. Now then, Andrew, I'm going to give you the last word. Churchill was a great writer, we know that. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, largely for his histories. I think that's about the only prize you haven't won, actually, Andrew, isn't it?
Give me time.
Yeah, give you time. But Churchill, the poet, I think is not that well known. There are probably reasons for that, largely because he only wrote one poem. Andrew, I hand over to you to take us out and tell us what that poem was.
It's a poem called Influenza, and it was written at the time of the Russian flu of 1891 to 92, which killed 1 million people in Western Europe. I'm going to read you the first and the penultimate stanzas. I found it in the Harrovian magazine because he wrote it when he was 15 years old for that magazine. Oh, how shall I its deeds recount, or measure the untold amount of ills that it has done? From China's bright celestial land, e'en to Arabia's thirsty sand, it journeyed with the sun. Then it goes through the next 13 stanzas explaining how it goes westward and ravaged the Europe. And then it ends like this. For though it ravaged far and wide, both village, town and countryside, its power to kill was o'er. And with the favouring winds of spring, blessed is the time of which I sing, it left our native shore.
We all look forward to that happening. And Andrew, thank you very much for being with us tonight. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.